Well, it is 9:01, and I believe we have the majority of our participants on the Zoom. So a big welcome to everyone for attending today's training. And Allie, if you want to move to the next slide. You are attending our school meals training for the summer 2021. In today's training, we will be reviewing the school meals regulations as well as what to expect for school year 21-22. So let's move to the next slide. Some housekeeping that we just want to discuss with you today is please be assured that we will have some stand and stretch breaks throughout the day. That will give you a chance to kind of re-energize. We will have 30 minutes for lunch, and that will probably be around 12 noon. But it may vary just a little bit, but you will have at least 30 minutes for lunch. Our goal is to finish by 3:30 today, so a little bit earlier than what was on the training flyer. And I bet that makes most of you very happy that we will be ending a little bit earlier than anticipated. We ask that you mute your microphone during today's presentation. And if you are so inclined, please turn on your camera. We want to see you. It's been a long time since we've seen our food service folks, and it just helps us gauge your understanding of the material that we're presenting today. So if you're so inclined, please feel free to turn on your camera. If you have questions throughout today's presentation, please use the chat box because we will be answering your questions throughout the presentation. We will probably take a little break before lunch and address questions in the chat box. And also at the end of today's presentation, there will be plenty of time to answer any questions you have. But please use the chat box. We want to hear from you. And please feel free to ask any questions that you have. There really isn't any questions that we want to make sure you understand the program, and the only way you are going to get your questions answered is by asking them. And please have your handout packet available. We will be reviewing the handouts, and we have indicated on the slides throughout the presentation if there is a handout associated with the slide. This is just great information for you to print out and have available after today's presentation as well. So let's move on to the next slide.
Okay, something else just popped up.
Okay, we got that though. That's our slides and our hands out. Okay.
Okay, so I need you to mute your microphone if you're not muted, and you can tell that by the little red microphone in the corner, and if it has a slash through it, that just means you're muted. And so Allie, I want you to talk about the Zoom features, but before we do that, I want to introduce our presenters for today. My name is Sean Von Drotchek. I have Allie Lampman joining us today, and she is not only a presenter, but she is our Zoom master for today. Erica Arter will be presenting today. Donna Hadley and Beth Hawes will be joining us for the presentation today. We are all program specialists that work for the Department of Education Nutrition Services. We work in the school meals program and the summer food service program. And so I'm going to turn it over to our Zoom master, Allie, to talk about some of the features of Zoom that we will be using today.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, so throughout the presentation today, we're going to use several different Zoom features. We're going to review them a little bit now, but don't worry, when we get to the slides where we're going to use them, we'll talk about them more again. We're going to be using the polling question And so what will happen, a small screen is going to pop up on your screen with a question we have for you, and take some time to read through the multiple choices and make a selection and then submit your answer. And then the fun part about that is we'll share the polling results with everyone once everyone is done. The next thing we're going to use is if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should have a Zoom toolbar. This is where Sean was talking. You'll find your microphone to mute yourself if needed, but you'll also find a reaction button on that toolbar. And on that reaction button, you can select and activate different gestures. So when we ask you to do that, that is how you will find that feature. And then the last feature is annotate. We may ask you to annotate on a screen. And when you want to annotate, you look at your view options button, which is sometimes found at the top. So you click view options, and then it can be at the top or the bottom. I say that because everyone's Zoom screen looks a little different. And then you'll select the annotate from the menu. And then another bar will appear where you can select an option to interact on the screen. So you can actually like pick a heart and stamp it on the screen, or a check mark. Donna's doing an exercise where she'll ask you to do that. It's super fun. You can write a little note to Donna if you want how fun this is. And when we get to these again in the presentation, we'll cover them again. So that's what I have for Zoom features. Sean, back to you.
Thank you, Allie. Well, let's get on with the training. And so our goals for you today, based on attending this training, is that you will be able to plan lunch and breakfast menus that meet the USDA meal pattern requirements. You will be able to identify reimbursable meals, and you will be able to complete the daily record keeping requirements, which would be the production records, the daily production records, and the HACCP logs and information required for HACCP. So that is our goal today. And let's move on to the next slide. So those of you that may be new to the school meals program need to have an understanding of why your school is participating in this federal program. Well, your school is receiving reimbursement for those meals that are served in schools, and USDA provides those federal dollars for those meals. That funding, those federal dollars, are funneled through the Nebraska Department of Education Nutrition Services. We distribute those dollars to schools that submit their claim for reimbursement. But in order to receive that funding, schools and residential facilities are required to meet the USDA guidelines to receive those funds. Our job also at the Department of Education is to ensure that you understand those rules and regulations. And so that is why we provide training. And the training today will go through the meal pattern requirements and the needed documentation, as well as other information that you need to know to ensure that you are in compliance with those regulations. Our job also is to audit or review your programs to ensure that you are in compliance. Those reviews are called administrative reviews, and we also conduct what's called a procurement review. Those reviews, the administrative review, happens every 5 years, or as needed if issues arise earlier, but typically it's once every 5 years. Procurement reviews are often conducted at the same time as administrative reviews. Some of you may be asking, well, how do I know when I'm going to be reviewed? Well, we notify our schools that are up for review at the beginning of the school year so that they have ample notice of the review. For this coming school year, we have not set our review schedule yet. So if you're wondering, well, do we have a review this year? Wait until we send out the notification. You will receive a notification if you will be having an administrative review this year. So ample notice is provided, and we do walk you through the process of preparing for an administrative review and procurement review. Next slide. I don't think we can talk about the upcoming school year without looking back at last year. And in fact, without looking back to the unanticipated school closures that happened in March of 2019 when schools had to close because of the pandemic. Last year and back in March, it required a lot from our food service folks. It required a lot of flexibility and innovation to continue to serve students. And our food service folks rose to the occasion. The motto on the slide, I think, really captures how most of you probably felt. We will just go with the flow and make it happen. And you did. You rose to the occasion, and students continued to get healthy meals. So we, as a team, we applaud you. You did a great job. But we need to look forward to what's coming in the next school year. And so next slide, Allie. USDA in April released new and extended waivers to address program operation flexibilities for the start of the new school year in August. And these nationwide waivers apply to all school food authorities. And throughout today's presentation, you'll probably hear us use the acronym SFAs. That refers to, as I said, school food authorities. So every school that participates in the program is a school food authority. These nationwide waivers, as I said, apply to all that choose to utilize these waivers. There is not a separate application to participate in these waivers because they are extended to all. So how we know about if you're utilizing the waivers is through your application that is submitted annually to the department. Many of you probably complete that application and know there's been a little bit of a holdup on completing it. But that's how we know if you are choosing to participate in one of the waivers that is most important, which we will be covering. Now, if you are interested, the link to all of the waivers, there's been about 95 waivers since the start of the pandemic that have allowed numerous flexibilities. Some are new waivers, some have been extended waivers multiple times. But you can find all of the waivers on our nutrition services website at the following link on your slide. So moving on to the next slide. These waivers address continued flexibilities for school year 21-22. It is USDA's way of transitioning us all back to a more normal school year, but still taking into consideration we are in a pandemic. So we will move on to the next slide. So what do you need to know for school year 21-22? Well, probably the most important thing is that the summer food service program which was allowed through a waiver for schools to participate in last school year, was not extended. So schools can no longer participate in the summer food service program once school starts in August. School food authorities, SFAs, may offer to all enrolled students free meals for school year 21-22 if they choose to participate in the seamless summer option. The seamless summer option is part of the school meals program. And that was in Child Nutrition Response Waiver 85 that allows schools to choose to participate in this option. Other good news that USDA released through waiver number 86 was that the seamless summer option, SSO, as we will refer to in this presentation, those meals will be reimbursed at the summer food service program rate, which is the higher rate of reimbursement. So on your screen, you can see what that reimbursement will be for this upcoming school year. This information is also found on our website under quick links. If you would like to refer to it later, you can find all of the reimbursement rates for all of the programs that are operated through nutrition services through that link. So let's move on to the next slide. So what was USDA's rationale for allowing our SFAs to participate in the seamless summer option? Well, to serve higher quality, more nutritious meals as required by planning menus based on meeting the school breakfast and lunch meal patterns. So returning to those meal patterns for this school year, which we will be going into much more detail later in the presentation. And by offering meals free of charge to all students, it promotes program access because all students can eat free of charge. And because we are still in a pandemic and households have experienced losses of income, it's just been a very unsettling time that by offering these meals free of charge to students, we can ensure that students are receiving healthy meals through the school meals program. And also the administrative burden that can be associated with the school meals program, that when students eat meals free of charge, then it reduces the burden of tracking paid, free, and reduced eligibility. Although households still need to complete the application process and determinations need to be made, that a meal count would be just the free number of students, the free count of meals. So not counting by the different categories. So reducing that administrative burden for schools. So let's move on to the next slide. So more information on what you need to know for school year 21-22. Our SFAs are not required to participate in the seamless summer option. Schools can choose to operate the traditional National School lunch and breakfast program if they want to. For the traditional school lunch and breakfast programs, meals must be claimed by students' eligibility, so by free, reduced, and paid. The rates of reimbursement would be under the school meals program, and the rates of reimbursement are lower than the reimbursement rates for the seamless summer option. As I said, this is a school's decision. The seamless summer option is available to all schools and residential facilities if they choose to utilize it as indicated on their school meals application. Next slide. The after-school care snack program I want to address because under the seamless summer option, SFAs are limited to serving 2 meals or 1 meal and 1 snack. So if you have an after-school care snack program that you have traditionally operated, you would need to participate in that program under the traditional school meals after school snack program if you are choosing to operate breakfast and lunch under the seamless summer option. And you would be reimbursed at the school meals rate, which is so slightly lower than if that after school snack is offered under the seamless summer. I believe there's 2 cents different. But just to give you a heads up that you are limited to only 2 meals or 1 meal and 1 snack under the seamless summer option. Next slide. Well, USDA also extended additional waivers that promote operational flexibilities for all SFAs for school year 21-22 based on what is happening with the pandemic, the uncertainty of the pandemic. So SFAs may use any of the above waivers for the duration and extent needed. So those flexibilities include the non-congregate meals, so meals that are provided to remote learners. They can be taken off-site, so non-congregate meals. Mealtime flexibility in regard to that. So perhaps that might be providing meals at a different time than the traditional breakfast and lunch times for those non-congregate meals, allowing for parent guardian pickup of those meals, and then also the flexibility of not utilizing, or the requirement, I guess, of not having to implement offer versus serve for high school students, because that is a requirement that high school students for lunch have to be offered the option of offer versus serve. And offer versus serve is a serving option that we will be discussing later in the presentation for those of you that are new. So just keep in mind, there are these flexibilities based on what a school is experiencing with the pandemic that would provide for the continuation of meals as needed, but only during the duration and extent needed. So let's move on to the next slide. So we want to find out from you with our polling question, what option will your school be participating in for school year 21-22? And so the first answer that will pop up on your screen is undecided at this point. The traditional breakfast and lunch school meal program, so not utilizing the seamless summer option and utilizing just the traditional. The third option is the seamless summer option for breakfast and lunch. And then underneath that, there's the option of utilizing the seamless summer option for breakfast and lunch. And if you have an after-school snack program, participating that under the traditional school meals program. So we'll give you just a few seconds to mark your response, and then we will come back and look to see what our audience has selected. Allie, how are we doing with responses?
Let's see, we're about almost to 70% responded. So we'll just give
Okay.
maybe 10 more seconds here.
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay. I'll share the results.
Okay, well, it looks like we have 20% that have not decided at this point. Okay, and that decision needs to be made because I know school will be starting pretty quickly for our Nebraska schools, probably in the next couple of weeks. The traditional breakfast and lunch school meal program, we have 23%. 49% plus the 10%, about 59% of our participants will be participating in the seamless summer option. So that's where we are with our audience today. And we'll close the poll, and I'm going to turn it over to Donna. And Donna will be talking about the lunch meal pattern requirements.
Thank you, Sean. It's so good to see everybody here today. Glad you could make it and take some of your time to spend the day with us and go through and refresh our memories about some of these regulations and meal patterns. I know that we have talked about as a group how we've worked with, as you have probably, the summer meal pattern, and you haven't worked with the NSLP and SBP patterns for a while. So we're going to talk about the meal patterns, and we're also going to throw in some new information along the way. So the first slide we're looking at here, the lunch meal pattern requirements. This is the first handout in your packet, and it's probably pretty familiar to you because I have it right here on my desk. I use it almost every day to refresh my memory about portion sizes and components and so on. So we know that in 2012, it became a food-based meal pattern, and there are 5 components we'll be talking about and different grade group levels. And we'll also talk about preschool meal pattern a little bit later in today's presentation. So you can refer back to this as we go through the lunch meal pattern requirements. So if you want to go to the next slide, Allie, please. So what does this mean, food-based meal pattern? Well, it requires foods to be served from different food groups, which we're familiar with that terminology, but we call them components, as you know. And it requires portion sizes to be based on specific grade groups. And there's also another standard that we have to meet. We have to meet the USDA nutrient standards in addition. So on the next slide, it shows the meal components, and there are 5 of them, as you know. There's meat, meat alternate, fruits, vegetables, grains, and milk. And then the required grade groups are shown on the next slide, and we do have them broken down into grades K through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12, but there's quite a bit of overlap, as we'll see, in grades K through 8. And depending upon the school, I know some of you guys are from K through 8 schools, some of you maybe are just at a high school or maybe at a middle school. So it helps to give you more flexibility depending on the grade group served, because a lot of schools combine K through 5 and 6 through 8, if that works for them. All right, so let's go through the different components, and let's start on the next slide with meat alternate. And we see here that we have daily requirements that we must be aware of. And for K through 8, actually, it's 1 ounce equivalent. And we call them equivalents here because it may not just be meat, but it may include some meat alternate like cheese and egg and so on. The 9th through 12th grade group is 2 ounces. And then we have weekly requirements, and the weekly requirements are based on a week that has 5 days in it. Hopefully we don't have to go to school any more than that, right? 6 or 7. So we have weekly requirements that are different. You see that for K through 5, it's 8 ounces, 6 through 8, 9, and 9 through 12 is 10. So the math really only works for 9 through 12. You take 2 times 5, and that equals 10. So when we're talking about meat alternate and the serving sizes, basically, if you serve hamburgers on any given day, you know that you're going to be giving them more than 1 ounce of meat. And so most of the time there is at least 2 ounces offered, which covers everybody's weekly requirements. So looking at some of the specifics for meat alternate on the next slide. The meat alternate must be served in the main dish or the main dish and one other menu item, which is on the next slide. There we go. Thank you. And for districts that do not offer entree choices, now we really do promote offering entree choices and encourage you to do so. However, if you do not, the same form of meat should not be served more than 3 times per week. And I think for me anyway, this question comes up most often when schools are involved in the Beef in Schools program, and they'll say, well, how many times a week can we serve beef? And most schools who are in that program serve it 2 times per week, maybe on a Tuesday and Thursday. That's pretty common, but it can't be served any more than 3 times per week because we have to keep those nutrient standards in mind also. On the next slide, we talk about meat alternate examples. Of course, meat means meat, poultry, seafood, and then that also we include cheese, yogurt, eggs. But there are some alternates here that you may not think of as contributing to the meat component, and that they are nuts and seeds, for example, which are not to exceed 50% of the daily requirement. We'll look at some examples of those later. Dried beans and peas, which are sometimes known as legumes, credit as a meat alternate, or they can credit as a vegetable, but you can't double dip and credit as both in the same meal. And then we have tofu and soy yogurt. And this is where I miss seeing you guys in person and asking how many of you serve tofu and watch no hands go up. But it's an option, and maybe some of you have. So that's very cool. Okay, so on the next slide, the creditable meat alternates, we see here, how do we credit things like cheese? Well, an ounce equals an ounce, so that's pretty easy. Dried beans and peas are 1/4 cup equals an ounce. Cottage cheese, also 1/4 cup. 1 large egg equals 2 ounces. And then we get to peanut butter. And I always have to kind of smile at this one because you have to serve 2 tablespoons of peanut butter to equal 1 ounce. So if you're making your own peanut butter sandwiches and you want it to credit properly for the 9 through 12 grade group, you would have to put 4 tablespoons, 1/4 cup of peanut butter on that sandwich. And then those students may not be able to get their mouths unstuck for the rest of the day. I don't know. But bear in mind that it does take more of the peanut butter, almond butter, and things like that. Yogurt, 4 ounces is an ounce, and tofu, we have to have 2.2 ounces or 1/4 cup. So let's just for a second here talk about non-creditable items. We'll talk about those more later in the presentation, but unfortunately, no, bacon is not one of those that you can credit. I believe turkey bacon is now on the list though, and Erica can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. Canned chicken noodle soup is non-creditable because it typically doesn't have enough meat or chicken in it. And then if you have imitation cheeses or commercial non-commodity cheese sauces or powdered mixes, they also do not credit in this category. So on the next slide, we see some combination foods. Now it's really, really common for you guys to have these and serve them. Things like vegetable beef soup or sloppy joe on a bun. Now sloppy joe on a bun, of course, would credit meat alternate, and also grain. Chicken and noodles, if you make it yourself and you put enough chicken in it to credit, would also credit as meat and grain. A taco salad, you have even more options there, because not only would it credit as a meat if you have enough meat, at least an ounce of meat on it, but a taco salad could also credit as a grain. And depending upon the amount of vegetable, lettuce, and so on that you have in your salad, that could also credit. And I forgot to mention too, the cheese would also credit as the meat alternate. And then we have an apple crisp, we have grain, depending on the topping you use, but grain, and fruit, of course. So on the next slide, we want to get you started using that annotation feature. And we know vegetable beef soup is going to credit in more than one category. And so I want you to annotate, go up to the top of your screen and pull down the annotation bar as Allie talked about, and put your annotation marks in the boxes of the component groups that, there we go, that it would credit in. I always get excited watching people start to use this, because this thing is fun. All right, we have lots of gold stars. People like the gold stars. Oh yeah, we have some lines. Aha, someone is drawing pictures. You guys are good. Don't tell them, but you're catching on to this quicker than the other group did. Well, that looks like artwork I might want to put on my wall. Okay, maybe that's going too far. All right. You guys did a wonderful job and so colorful. Okay, so we know that beef, it's going to credit meat alternate if you do have enough to credit in the recipe or in however you make it. And then vegetables, also we would expect that it would credit, and it may have a lot of different vegetables in it, so you could maybe credit in one subgroup or another, but you could credit in the other category for vegetables. So meat and vegetables, depending on what you put in your soup, maybe you put barley in your vegetable beef soup, then you could possibly credit grains, but typically the vegetables and the meat. And thank you for doing such a great job. All right, next, let's go to fruits on the next slide. And we see that the daily requirements are K through 8, 1/2 cup, and 1 cup from 9 through 12. And you multiply any of those values by 5 and you get the weekly requirement. So that makes perfect sense. On the next slide, we see that there are some things we need to be aware of. Fruit should be canned in juice or light syrup. And if you're serving fruit juice, it can't be a fruit aid or any other product that is not 100% fruit juice. And then no more than half of the fruit offerings over the week may be in the form of juice. So a couple of things to be aware of when we're talking about juice as an offering, because it definitely is acceptable. 1/4 cup of dried fruit, such as dried cranberries or raisins, equals 1/2 cup of fruit. And I know that a few years ago, the last year, I think we were out there on review, that commodities had a lot of those dried cherries and the kids were just loving them. So that would fit in that category too. The minimum serving size to credit is 1/8 cup. And the 1/8 cup was established to distinguish it from a garnish. So you can credit 1/8 cup of fruit. But there is something, as we see on the next slide, that is not creditable towards a reimbursable meal. And those are the snack type fruit products that cannot credit as fruit leathers, fruit shapes, and so on. All right, next category is my absolute favorite, and that is vegetables. So we have K through 8, a daily requirement of 3/4 cup, and 9 through 12, a requirement of 1 cup. And then the weekly requirements are 5 times that amount. So let's talk more about vegetables because we get to talk about colors and food groups and all kinds of good stuff. Subgroups, I should say. So on the next slide, we see that again, there is a juice issue to keep in mind, that it has to be, if it's a vegetable juice, has to be 100% vegetable juice to credit and to be served. Canned soup that is vegetable based, a 1 cup serving typically credits as a 1/4 cup vegetable unless a CN label on the product tells you otherwise. And then we have the cooked beans. Dried beans and peas may count as a meat alternative and vegetable, or a vegetable but not both, as we mentioned earlier. And again, with vegetables, the minimum serving size to credit is 1/8 cup. And we have here in the non-creditable category potato chips and pizza sauce. But when we talk about non-creditable foods, we'll find that some of those have changed, and that will come later. Okay, so the next slide shows us the very colorful subgroups of vegetables. And the minimum amount to plan for each of these subgroups is per week. There are no daily requirements. So we know we have to meet the dark green, red, orange, dried beans and peas, starchy, and other categories in the vegetable subgroups. Now, there is a vegetable subgroup handout. It's number 2 in your handout packet. And there have been some changes made to this one. I think a couple of years ago, we made some changes. It just seems so weird because you talk about something you did a couple of years ago, and it still, we haven't talked to you about it directly for a couple of years. Kind of strange. Anyway, so if you look on this, you'll find that we did move some things around you probably wouldn't remember, because to tell you the truth, I don't remember it either, except for one thing I want to point out is that pickles are now on the list. Pickles are allowable, and this is really helpful in the case of putting together a sack lunch for a student, which has been happening a lot in the past year and a half. And, sack lunch may include a sandwich, and that pickle spear could credit as a 1/4 cup towards your requirement. Now, we don't recommend that you let students count a 1/2 cup of pickles as what they need to have on a reimbursable meal tray, but because we have to watch sodium levels too, and we want to see more variety in that, but pickles can contribute. So let's talk about the subgroups. Let's talk first about the dark green subgroup on the next slide. And the portion size is pretty easy here for grades K through 12, 1/2 cup per week. Okay, so I have some broccoli today in my refrigerator, some local broccoli I bought that is delicious, but you know what has happened to me? I started working with school lunch and I started using ranch. Don't tell anybody. But broccoli dipped in low-fat ranch is amazing. It's wonderful, and I know why the kids like it. We also talk here about romaine. Romaine and spinach, especially mixed together, are something that we see a lot on the fruit and vegetable bars. So on the next slide, we'll talk about portion sizes. And we'll find out that when you're talking about the leafy salad greens, such as romaine or spinach, that you have to serve 1 full cup, so it credits as 1/2 cup, because you'd have to really pack it down to get it to credit as, and fill it really, really full and damage the lettuce. So it credits as a 1/2 cup. Now, if you cook those leafy greens, and typically we talk about spinach here, then the cooked volume is equal to the crediting. So 1/2 cup cooked spinach is 1/2 cup vegetable in the dark green group. And I always ask about people serving spinach. I think I've only ever had one person raise her hand and say, yeah, my kids eat cooked spinach, but that's about it. So on the next slide, we have a very easy group to meet for the most part. Now, I've been talking about fruit and vegetable bars, and Beth's going to talk to you about the safety of that later. But some of you, I know, have pre-portioned things. You've done other things with your fruit and vegetable bar to keep it going, or to have serve them from the line. So, we're not assuming that everybody's going to just bust out and have a full-fledged fruit and vegetable bar. Portion size for grades K through 8 is 3/4 cup a week, and for 9 through 12, 1 1/4 cup, but that's not hard to meet because this is where tomatoes hang out and carrots. Baby carrots are so popular, and here we go with the ranch again. Sweet potatoes as sweet potato fries. Some schools seem to like those and some don't. And then red peppers are also in this category. Next slide, we have probably the least, I don't want to call it the least favorite. I personally love legumes, dried beans and peas, but I know that this can sometimes be tough for people to incorporate into their menu. And we do have some items that you guys use, and I know you've shared before in trainings what you do to incorporate the legumes, and not only chili, but also things like someone has a recipe for basketball soup with garbanzo beans that they serve on a basketball day. And there are also people who make dips and put it in tortillas and make refried beans. It's interesting. Students at some schools really like refried beans and some not so much, but you guys can get creative. And then also we have the roasted beans, and not only just garbanzo beans roasted and turned crispy and crunchy and use them on the bar, but also people have said, I do any kind of bean like that, any kind of kidney bean and so on. So examples, we have a 1/2 cup serving per week. And the black bean salsa, I forgot to mention that, that's also very popular. Examples can be vegetarian, and then we have some other examples there, but there are many examples of beans we can use. And beans are one of the categories in the harvest of the month for farm to school, because, I wasn't aware that Nebraska was such a big bean producer, but there are a lot of beans, as some of you know, that are grown in the western part of the state. So next up on the next slide is the subgroup starchy. And again, 1/2 cup a week, but there's no problem meeting this requirement because this contains potatoes. So French fries, mashed potatoes, corn, and we know that corn is very popular here in Nebraska, and also peas. And then on the next slide, the other subgroup. This is where other vegetables are just kind of thrown into the category. 1/2 cup K through 8, 3/4 cup 9 through 12. And this is where we see examples of some very nutritious vegetables, by the way. Cabbage. I always want to point out the green beans is in this category because some people like to put them in the green, dark green category. Nope. Or the dried peas and beans, and they don't fit there either. They are in the other category. But cucumbers are also super popular. And this is also an item that's easier to purchase locally. And again, ranch dressing kind of helps this along a little bit. But now when we talk about lettuce in this category, we're talking about things like iceberg that doesn't have the nutritional value of the dark green romaine. Mixed vegetables and blends on the next slide. We can look at classic mixed vegetables. There are too many to offer a minimum of 1/8 cup each, so you could put those in the other category. California blend, however, is something else if you ever use this blend in your meals, because if you would provide a 3/4 cup serving, you could break it down into 1/3 of in each category of red, green, and other. Okay, so we're getting ready here to talk about next, grains. The grains group here has been expanded a little bit to explain the term whole grain rich. So we're going to take a few slides here, take some time going through them and explain the concept. So please ask any questions you have in the chat box, because this can be a little bit confusing. Now, when we're talking about grains, we're talking about daily requirements for K through 8 of 1 ounce per day 9 through 12, 2 ounces. The weekly requirements for K through 8 are 8 ounces, and 9 through 12, 10 ounces. It's kind of like the meat alternate category, where if you serve anything like a bun, you know you're going to meet the 2 ounce requirement. You can definitely offer 2 ounces of grain across the board, and then you're meeting the weekly requirement for K through 8 and the daily weekly for 9 through 12. So that seems to work well for a lot of people. On the next slide, this is where we have a change in meal pattern for this coming year. All grain items, instead of just 50% of grain items, now it is all grain items offered at both breakfast and lunch must be whole grain rich, or they can be 100% whole grain. And to start us off here with our definition of whole grain rich, it means that at least 50% of the grains in the product must be composed of whole grains by weight. And we're going to talk about some ways that we can look at labels and determine if this is in the product. The remaining grains in the product must be enriched. So 50% whole grains, remaining grains must be enriched. So this starts our discussion. And on the next slide, we see 3 terms that we're going to be talking about. We have whole grain rich, and enriched. So we're going to start by looking at the term whole grain. What does it really mean? Man, this is confusing already. So we hope to get it cleared up for you. Next slide, please. And we're going to start with the grain kernel. Picture of a grain kernel here. We see 3 parts of the grain kernel. The bran is on, of course, the outside, and it's the covering, it's protection, it protects the seed, but it also, as we know, has fiber, B vitamins, and trace minerals. And I have to tell you, I had my bowl of oatmeal this morning, and I always put a heaping spoonful of wheat bran in with my oatmeal to add a little more fiber, because, you know, Donna's getting older and we need to keep things moving. So the outer shell is a source of fiber, B vitamins, and trace minerals, which are minerals we need in smaller amounts during the day. And it does have some nutritional value besides just fiber. Now, the big part here that we see in the middle, the kind of pinkish part, that's called the endosperm. And this is where we see the energy that is stored for the seed in case it wants to turn into a plant. So this is where the carbohydrates and the protein are located. And then the gray matter down there at the bottom is basically the germ. It is the reproductive part of the grain kernel, and it provides nourishment for the seed, in addition to antioxidants and vitamin E in particular, along with some B vitamins. So those are the 3 parts of the grain kernel. And a whole grain contains all 3 of those parts. Now I'm going to turn on my camera, and we're going to do something. This is going to be familiar to a lot of you who have attended other trainings. But Sean, I was wondering if you could help me out here, if you are available at this time.
Donna,
All right.
I'm always available for you.
All right, what a team. Okay, so remember that there are 3 parts of the grain kernel. You know how it's easy to remember them? We sing a song. The bran.
You picked the wrong person to sing with you.
Okay, so, but you know how it goes. You did great last time. The bran.
I'll move my lips.
Okay. Lip sync. You're that disqualifies you. The bran, the germ, and the endosperm. Come on, everybody. Germ and the endosperm. Bran, the germ, and the endosperm. Come on, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm.
I know that was a lot to take in for our audience.
Well, I'm sure everybody else did a great job too, but let's give Sean a round of applause.
And
Yes.
Donna, she is a trooper.
All righty, let's get back to our slides. Thank you, Sean. Okay, so we know the three parts of the grain kernel. So let's talk about recent additions to the whole grain list. These, again, I believe come from 2019, but we haven't talked to them about them a lot. Corn masa, corn flour, which is sometimes known as masa harina. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not. Hominy grits. These ingredients can be credited as whole grain. And you have a handout, pages 3 and 4 in your handout packet. Very comprehensive whole grain list. And I admit that I am copying this from Connecticut, but that's perfectly acceptable. I'm giving them credit, and they have done a great job with listing every ingredient that you could think of, or every food that you could think of that is a whole grain, and then that there's explanations at the bottom of the second page. So we're using that instead of redoing or revamping our handout. Continuing with recent additions on the next slide, let's talk a minute about cornmeal. To be able to credit cornmeal as a whole grain, it must be made with whole grain corn, which we see a lot on labels. We see whole grain cornmeal or cornmeal, whole grain. Or it must be made with nixtamalized corn to be credited as a whole grain. Now, what is nixtamalized? Nixtamalized means that it has been treated with an alkaline substance, and that actually allows the nutrients to be more digestible and also makes it a good flavor for use in things like tortillas and so on. Cornmeal that is enriched, if it just says enriched cornmeal, cannot be credited as a whole grain. It does have to meet the two criteria in the first statement. On the next slide, we see that we can also credit popcorn. And popcorn's a great source of fiber. The problem with popcorn is that you have to serve quite a bit of it so that it will equal an ounce equivalent, let's say, of whole grain. There has to be 3 cups of popcorn. And I'm not sure that the custodians would appreciate serving popcorn as part of a meal because of the work involved later, maybe. However, someone came up with a great idea of making a snack mix of popcorn and whole grain rich cereals and pretzels, which would be great to serve in the after school snack program. So that would be something that would be kind of fun to put together. All right, on our next slide then, we have talked about whole grain, all three parts of the grain kernel. The whole grain kernel is included. Now let's talk about that term enriched. And to do that, we're going back to the grain kernel again on the next slide. And we're going to look at what enriched means. Enriched means that when white flour and white rice are made, the bran is stripped away and the germ is stripped away from the grain kernel. And these products are made from only the endosperm. So we're losing some of the nutrients that the whole grain provides. That's the whole idea behind requiring whole grains in the school lunch program, is because they are more nutritious, because these nutrients are stripped away. So in the next slide, we see, okay, they've stripped away these nutrients, but they're going to add some of them back. There are 5 nutrients added, and FDA specifies how much are added to white enriched flour, for example. And these are all, the first 4 listed here are all B vitamins that are taken out of the grain, and then iron is also removed. So by taking away the germ and the bran. So these are added back to the product. And on the next slide, we see that this is what we might see on an ingredient list. Okay, this is a great example of, you know, a whole grain rich product, because whole wheat flour is the first ingredient. And then we see the words enriched flour with the ingredients in that enriched flour in parentheses, and it includes those B vitamins and also iron. So that's what we'll be looking for a little bit later when we look at labels. So now on the next slide, are we ready? We're going to tackle the biggest term, whole grain rich. Okay, and before we do that, it is 10 o'clock or 10:01, and I am going to say, let's take a 2-minute stretch break and get up and move around, dance around, sing the whole grain song if you want to. And we'll see you back here at 10:04. Okay, it is 10:04. I just want to comment that those of you at Fort Calhoun, man, you have enough people to have a party. Yeah, looking good. I'm sure there are others out there that you're in a group. So we know that this type of training, you know, we all miss in person, but there is an advantage to this type of training because we're reaching a lot more people with the virtual training, which is kind of nice. Okay, so you ready to talk about whole grain rich? Let's do it. Next slide, please, Allie. Okay, so there are 3 criteria to meet the definition of whole grain rich. And don't get too tied up in a lot of this because we're going to try to simplify it for you as much as we can with some examples. Okay, so it must contain, as we said before, at least 50% whole grains by weight. So that means that a whole grain is the first ingredient on the in the ingredient label, or if water is the first ingredient, the second ingredient must be a whole grain. And we'll see that in some products that need, if you have a product that's all ready to go, like bread that's already been baked, but if you have rolls that need to be baked off before you serve them, then that means that water may be the first ingredient. Any remaining grain ingredients are enriched, and then there might be small, tiny amounts of grain ingredients in these products, and we call those non-creditable if they are less than 2% of the product formula. So on the next slide, we're going to list some things we will look at to determine if a product is whole grain rich. The first one is the ingredient list, and that's a great place to start because we've already talked about this and said, you know, whole grains, first ingredient, and yada, yada. Then we look for child nutrition labels. And these are especially helpful for combination foods, which is something we'll look at in a little bit. And if you can't get a child nutrition label, which by the way, it provides crediting information. And by crediting, I mean, it tells us how much of a food component it is in the product, so we know if we're meeting the meal pattern requirements. Product formulation statement is something you can ask the company for if they do not have a child nutrition label on their product, because it will also tell you how the product credits. And if you make things from scratch and you have some recipes, the school recipe is a good source, and I happen to be the person who's talking about recipes later. So we'll dive into recipes and find out how that works. Then there are two other things that are on the package, the FDA's whole grain health claim, which we'll look at in a minute, and if the product contains at least 8 grams whole grain per ounce equivalent. So let's look at the next slide, which shows us the product ingredient list. This is a good example. These breadsticks on the right, you see in their ingredient list, whole wheat flour is the first ingredient. Now we have to be careful and go to our whole grain list sometimes, because if you see something that lists wheat flour, that is not whole grain. It has to say whole wheat flour. Water is the second ingredient, and then we have enriched, unbleached wheat flour, and we'll talk about unbleached in a couple more slides. But enriched flour, and then in parenthesis, the ingredients in that enriched flour. Okay, so that's the ingredient list, pretty easy. Now, what do we do with mixed items and non-mixed items? Okay, so let's clarify that when we talk about a non-mixed grain item, we're talking about something that is considered to be just grain. It can only credit in grains like breads, cereals, rolls, breadsticks, and so on. And we know whole grain must be the first ingredient. Have I said that enough times? Do you think I should say it anymore? I think that's probably, you guys probably have that down. For mixed component items, such as pizza, chicken nuggets, okay, chicken nuggets is a good example. On the next slide, please. Chicken nuggets is good to look at because you have breading on the chicken nuggets. You have breading on chicken patties, chicken strips, pork patties, and so on. So we call these mixed component items. And pizza, of course, we have toppings that could credit in another component category, but then we have the crust. Whole grain must be the first grain ingredient listed by weight. And so we will look at an example of that later. Next up is on the next slide, child nutrition label. The child nutrition label, this is a good example of a mixed dish that shows us, it's a chicken stir-fry bowl, that it provides 1.5 ounce equivalents meat and 1 ounce equivalent of grain. Now, I forgot to mention when we started talking about grains that we talk about ounce equivalents. And so Erica will talk about calculating ounce equivalents a little bit later, but that's what they are referred to as ounce equivalents of grains. And because this is on a CN label, it means that it can credit in the whole grain rich category. And then we have other vegetables listed. I mean, everything that can be credited in that chicken stir-fry bowl is listed here. So we can't find, or we don't have a CN label. Then we go to the next slide and we ask the company for a product formulation statement, which is also sometimes referred to as a specification statement. But this one at the top does say formulation statement. And this is very small. I don't expect you to be able to see this very well, but you notice that there is a table, and the right column in the table talks about creditable amounts. And we see that it's a total creditable amount is 2 grains, and it is a whole grain rich product because Whole wheat flour is 47%. Enriched flour, I just looked at this, is 22%. It's more than half of the grains in the product. Yeah, so whole wheat flour, so it would credit. So this is not really the best example of a product formulation statement because it doesn't have a signature. Product formulation statement should be printed with the name, product code number, crediting statement, and signed and dated by an official of the manufacturer. So this one is not signed, but I believe maybe the one in your packet is, and you'll probably get to that later when we talk about labels. Next up is looking for whole grain rich in school recipes. If 50% or more of the grain is whole grain, in this recipe, it happens to be cornbread. And we look down here at flour enriched bleached, 1 pound, flour whole wheat, and cornmeal whole grain, both whole grain items. And they are 1.5 pounds total, so definitely fit more than 50% of the grain is whole grain, and that would make it a whole grain rich recipe. I just wanted to mention bleached and unbleached. I get some questions about that. I think we all do it at times. And basically, flour must be aged after it's milled. It must be aged to improve baking performance, and it can be a little yellow in color in the beginning. And if it's allowed to sit for a while, it naturally takes care of the color, and the flour will age so it will perform better for baking. Some manufacturers, want to speed this up a little bit, so they use chlorine gas or maybe benzoyl peroxide or other ingredients that are determined to be safe to use to bleach the flour to improve the baking quality and also improve the color. And you'll still see that cake flour, for example, is bleached because when you make a cake, if you're making a white cake, you don't want it to be yellow. So, you want it to be a nice white in color. So that's the difference. They're both enriched typically. And so there's really no difference in the nutritional value. Okay, next slide shows an example of the FDA health claim. Let you read through that quickly. And you might see this heart on a product that tells you that the health claim has been awarded to the product. Okay, so next up, we have what happens when we offer multiple entrees. And we're talking about this because all entree choices must meet both daily and weekly meal pattern requirements. I've had someone ask me about the Uncrustables, for example, which are a pretty common second entree choice. So let's say you have a chicken patty sandwich one day, and the chicken credits as enough meat, and then you also have enough grain with the bun and the breading on the chicken patty. So you need to plan other entree choices if you offer them, which again, we do encourage, that provide the same amount of meat, at least the same amount of meat and grain in ounces and ounce equivalents. So for example, with a chef salad, you could add cheese and maybe meat to the chef salad so that if that student chooses a chef salad, they're getting the same meat alternate ounces, and grain serving, you could serve a roll, breadsticks, crackers. I mean, people get really creative with things like that. Another thing on a salad to meat alternate would be adding nuts and seeds to credit as 1 ounce for the day. Deli sandwich, again, you need the meat, you need the grain, and then the Uncrustable is the same thing. You need enough to be able to credit the equally for the main entree. And then the next slide talks about desserts. A total of 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich desserts may be offered per week, yay. But you also have to be careful and think about nutrition standards that must be considered when planning these menu items. So again, it's pretty easy to look at. You can make whole grain cookies, whole grain, you can use brown rice Krispies to make Rice Krispie treats, and then use whole grain and oatmeal and so on in your topping for your crisp. Okay, so we have an exercise here, but you're not going to be using the annotation on this one. I wish I'd put it in there. You guys are so good at it. But we're going to look at a few slides of a product. Now, the first slide, we'll look at the first slide of the product and then determine, let you take a minute to determine if it's whole grain rich. And then we'll look at the second slide. So the first slide of the first example is a whole grain rich corn dog. That's what it's called anyway. So I want you to look at the ingredient list and determine if that is a whole grain rich product. And you know what? If it is a whole grain rich product, why don't you put the check mark in the annotation on the slide? Let's use that annotation tool a little bit. Okay, next slide, Allie. Let's see if they are correct. Yes, definitely. We have water. We said water could be the first ingredient. Then we have whole wheat flour. Then we have whole grain corn. And definitely a whole grain rich product. Okay, good job, annotation people. Okay, product number 2. Are these white whole wheat breadsticks whole grain? And what does white whole wheat mean anyway? So let's use the annotation tool again. All right, next slide, Allie. Yes, you guys are good. You guys are very good. And here in green, we have the whole grain and enriched ingredients, whole wheat flour number 1, and then enriched unbleached wheat flour. And then there is, I put oat fiber in purple down here, less than 2% of, because it might be looked at as a grain product, but since it contains less than 2% oat fiber, well, that's okay. We don't really have to be concerned about it. And our last example, the next slide, please. Now, this is a 2-parter. I want you to find all the whole grain rich ingredients in this list and then mark it if it does meet the whole grain rich definition. Well, you guys are all over the place with this one. That's awesome. You're really marking it up. Marking every ingredient. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, these were pretty easy, right? I mean, of course, it's a whole grain rich because whole grain, everything in here is whole grain, every grain item. So you see them all listed there. And whole corn flour is, I mean, when they put things that are easy to understand and you don't have to think about, is that whole grain or not? That's a really good thing on these ingredient lists. Okay, so that ends whole grain, but now we're going to go into milk and talk about milk for a couple of slides here, and water. And milk, minimum daily requirement is 8 fluid ounces for grades K through 12. Now we know that this has to be served as a beverage as fluid milk. You can't count milk in pudding, milk used in a gravy, or anything like that. And you must offer at least 2 choices. You can have unflavored milk in either skim or 1%. And another change in the meal pattern is that the flavored milk must be skim, okay? Unflavored milk, skim, or 1%. Flavored milk, skim only. And again, you must offer at least 2 choices. And you can't offer any other beverage or promote any other beverage as an alternate to milk. You can, we're going to talk about offering water, of course, but you can't promote another beverage as an alternate. Milk must be offered at every meal. And on the next slide, we talk about milk substitutions, and there is a handout in your packet that's 2 pages in length. If you need to offer a non-dairy beverage that meets the USDA criteria, this is where you would go to find those that are approved to be used. And for the most part, they are soy milk, except we have a new addition that is very recent, and it's first in the list on the first page, Ripple pea milk, and that's PEA. Okay, so it's an alternative that has just come on the market, and all of these milks, the soy and the pea milk, they must have the same nutritional content as cow's milk. And so this handout's really good for, it's a good reference for you to use. Now, water is discussed on the next slide. Drinking water must be available to students at no charge where meals are served. And I like that clear container, the second picture from the left on this slide, because it looks very inviting, doesn't it? You can even add different fruits, vegetables. Some schools make flavored waters that make them more appealing and attractive. Again, you can't promote this over milk, but you definitely need to have it available with cups. Maybe some of you in your schools, they installed some of those water coolers that fill bottles. So you may have some things that kids may have their own bottles that they can fill from the fountain, but you do have to have this available. Now, a water fountain sometimes is not located directly in the lunchroom, but it must be very accessible, which means that it can't be far away from the lunchroom if you're going to use that as a water source instead of offering one of these other options. But do remember to offer cups. All right, next slide is non-creditable menu items. Okay, so now I want to mention, first of all, that these non-creditable menu items can be served, just like a regular cookie can be served. But you have to keep in mind that these items count toward the nutrient standards, which means that you have to watch your calories throughout the day. And then through the week, you know, your average for the week is what you're shooting for in terms of calories and things like that. And they can also increase food costs. So that's something to keep in mind. But in this category, we have condiments, fruit drinks or cocktails, which we don't see. I don't see any of those actually, or haven't seen them in schools. If you're serving juice, you're serving juice. Funyuns, potato chips once in a while, sure. Small bag of potato chips. Bacon can be used to flavor foods, for example. And then pudding and gelatin. And gelatin, even if it's made with fruit juice or has fruit in it, typically is not creditable. So again, it's an extra, that's a treat that can be offered. I know some schools, their kids love the gelatin, but you know, once in a while in moderation is the key here to keeping those calories and down. And you also have a handout in your packet that lists creditable and non-creditable items, and you will find some changes here to things like pepperoni, dried meat products, frozen pizzas. So you might want to look through that handout to familiarize yourself with that. Okay, so next up we have just a few slides of exercises. And now what we're looking at here is if these meals contain all the required components. We're not talking about serving sizes. We're just looking to make sure they have all the required components. So please mark either yes or no with your annotation in the yes or no box. And you don't have to use a check mark. There we go, we have a red X. You can use you can use lines. I missed it the first training session, but someone told me later they wrote, "I love you, Donna." So if you want to score extra points with me, that would be a good thing to write. Okay, we have a lot more no's so far than we have yeses. And if I were to talk to you, you would probably say that, nope. What is this missing? This is missing a grain. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we left this misspelling in here because we thought it was kind of funny. Over-baked chicken. Have you ever served over-baked chicken? I know I have here at home. Romaine salad, assorted relishes. Let's think of relishes as things like pickles and olives and so on. Rice pilaf and milk. Yes or no? Does it have all the components? Good job. Just too bad they don't know who you are. Okay, again, we have a lot more no's, and I believe the no is correct because it's missing fruit. Okay, our next slide gives us an example of a sack lunch. And this sack lunch contains a turkey cheese hoagie, some chips, an apple, a sugar cookie, and a juice box. Wow, it looks like you're all agreeing on this one. Big old no on that one. And you are again correct. Okay, so one of the things that we see that really sticks out is there's no milk. And that definitely has to be required. And, you know, people ask about, well, how do I transport milk in sack lunches? And having the milk in a separate cooler iced down is a great way to do that. Also, though, let's talk real quick about vegetable because there's no vegetable listed. Sun chips are definitely not vegetable. But there could be some vegetable on the turkey cheese hoagie, but it wouldn't be enough to credit as 3/4 cup for K through 8 or 1 cup for 9 through 12. This might be an example of where it might be helpful to stick in a pickle along with your carrots and whatever else you're offering to make that 1 cup for 9 through 12, which is typically a little bit hard to meet for some people. Okay, just a couple more. Next slide. Okay, we have a choice situation here, a grilled chicken sandwich or a chef salad, potato wedges, baked beans, watermelon, milk. That sounds kind of good. Oh, cool. We have a question mark. Yeah, I meant to mention that the sun chips, they wouldn't credit as a vegetable, of course, but they would, yeah, Sean, you're right, credit it as a whole grain rich product, yeah. Okay, so on this one, I really like the question mark because, yes, exactly. And then someone says there's grain for the chef salad. That's what we have to be concerned about. This meets the meal pattern requirements, except that we have to be, this is an example of, okay, we have to make sure the chef salad is equal to meeting meal pattern to the grilled chicken sandwich. So not only the meat alternate, but the grain has to be met with the chef salad. And here is our last one. The next slide is our last example. And we have another choice, a hamburger on a bun or a Southwest chicken wrap. And now we're throwing in the fruit vegetable bar. And we'll pretend that it's just an open fruit vegetable bar as it was before the pandemic, and milk. Okay, and yes, again, you guys are correct. Having the fruit vegetable bar saves a lot of issues or thinking about, am I meeting fruit and vegetable requirements? The only thing I want to mention here is that you basically have to be careful about the tortilla. And if you're serving this to high school students and they're getting one chicken wrap, that the tortilla counts as a 2-ounce grain equivalent. So that's it for me for a while. And I am now going to turn it over to Erica, who's going to talk to you about fruit and vegetable bars. Erica.
Thank you, Donna, and thanks for that great explanation of the lunch meal pattern. So up next, we're going to be talking about fruit and vegetable bars. And with the COVID restrictions last school year, we know that many schools were not able to have a fruit or vegetable bar. And we've been receiving a lot of questions as if these are going to be allowed for school year 21-22. And I think I even saw one pop up in the chat already. And the answer to that is you need to check with your local health department and see if salad bars are allowed in your area. Beth Haas from our office, like Donna said, is going to be joining us a little bit later to talk about HACCP. And if you have any specific safety questions regarding fruit and vegetable bars, you could ask those to her then. But for now, just know that you need to check with your local health department to see if those are allowed in your area for this school year. But in a normal school year, of course, fruit and vegetable bars do help with offering choices, increasing customer satisfaction and consumption. We all like to have choices when we're choosing foods to eat, and kids are no different. They also help meet weekly subgroup requirements. Like Donna talked about, if you put all of those subgroups out on your fruit and vegetable bar, you can pretty easily meet those subgroup requirements with the fruit and vegetable bar. Next slide, Allie. If you don't have a fruit or vegetable bar, or maybe you're not comfortable with offering a fruit and vegetable bar this year, or you're not allowed to, there are other ways to offer a variety of choices. I like this picture because it shows different ways to dish up or package individual portions. You can see the clear plastic cups here are all covered, and those would be an option if fruit and vegetable bars aren't allowed at your school, or you're not going to do that this year. And I still count a lot of different choices. I count 9 choices available here. I see 2 forms of carrots. I see the carrot sticks and the packaged baby carrots, celery, diced pears, some nice sliced cucumbers there. I think 1 cup of kiwi, maybe by the cucumbers, some pineapple, and over on the right-hand side, there's salad and mixed vegetables. The broccoli looks nice and green, like it's been blanched to give it that nice vibrant green color to make it appealing to the eye. And then some whole pieces of fruit. And those, you know, could all be ways to offer choices, and you could also cover those as a way to offer choices if you want to serve covered choices. You could serve these either from the line, either you're going to let them self-serve depending on what is allowed in your area, or have somebody serve those choices from the line. Next slide. And you know what they always say? They always say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here are a couple more examples of creative and attractive fruit and vegetable choices. On the top there, that one even has a little bit of dip or dressing in the bottom of the cup, maybe some of Donna's ranch dressing there in the bottom. And on the bottom, there are several pre-portioned fruit choices. They're really nice and colorful, and you can see there's a variety of textures and colors, different forms and shapes. There's fresh, frozen, canned. I see dried, either craisins or cherries or something, whole diced sliced. They all count as choices on your fruit and vegetable bar. Next slide. Another option, if you don't have a fruit and vegetable bar and you maybe don't necessarily have a line with shelving to set out those individual portions, an option would be that you could make up multiple relish trays and set them out at the end of the line. And this can also be a nice option for those lower grades who maybe aren't able to reach or see into your fruit and vegetable bar. So rather than denying them access to choices, you could set up relish trays as a way to offer the little kids the same choices. But you know, make sure you have nice tongs that will grab and serve easily to make sure that you keep the line moving, or set up multiple trays so that your line keeps moving. And we do recommend avoiding using mismatched or opaque containers where kids, especially the shorter, younger kids, can't, you know, even see into the container or see what's in there in order to select from the fruit and vegetable bar. Next slide. We do encourage fruit and vegetable bars for all ages when, you know, when there aren't COVID restrictions, of course. So even for those little kindergartners, we see that work at a lot of different schools. So we know that it can work. There are several schools that have successfully implemented this. So just want to let you know that if you're thinking about it, it can be done. If you don't have a fruit or vegetable bar this year due to COVID, this also might be a perfect time to work on modifying it to incorporate your younger grades. You could work with your maintenance or someone at your school to maybe develop a lower tray line or build some risers like you see here so that the students can reach those options themselves. Next slide. And we all know during the lunch period that time is our first enemy. The lunch period is so short that for many students, often a lot of food goes uneaten simply because the kids ran out of time to eat it. But one thing we can do, we can offer both whole and cut pieces as one way to approach this challenge. Kids are more likely to consume those cut pieces. Stats from the Smarter Lunchroom Cornell study showed that fruit sales increased by an average of 61% when the fruit was sliced. And in interviews conducted with kids, they disliked eating fruit because, for one, the younger students might have braces or missing teeth, and large fruit is too inconvenient to eat. And sometimes they just don't like eating that in front of others if they're not able to eat it with their missing teeth or their braces or whatever they may have. And I know this to be true. I have a son who's going to be in first grade this year. His 2 front teeth are loose and he loves to eat corn on the cob, but he's been having quite a bit of trouble with that this summer, trying to eat corn on the cob with 2 loose front teeth. Finally, this week, last night, he let me cut it off of the cob so that he could actually eat it without trying to like eat it off to the side or something. So next slide. Also, we just wanted to remind you, make sure you set out appropriate utensils. If you want the students to leave the line with a half a cup of fruit or vegetable, then, think about the size of spoodles that you're going to set out. Is 1 scoop enough to equal a half a cup, or do they need 2 scoops? And then make sure that you're communicating that with your point of service person. And we'll be talking more about offer versus serve and what needs to be on their tray coming up here. But nice utensils that they can easily grab the fruits and vegetables with or serve themselves with and get the appropriate amount of fruit or vegetables. Thanks. Okay, next slide. So switching gears a little bit here, up next, we're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, math. I don't know if it's everybody's favorite or maybe just mine, but up next, we'll talk about calculating grain servings. And since you do have those daily and weekly grain requirements, it's important to know how to determine how a grain item contributes to the meal pattern. Next slide. So how do you calculate a grain serving? First, you must determine the weight of your product, and you can do that either from the package information, the recipe information, or weighing the item on a food scale. You do need to have a food scale. And then your next step is to refer to the USDA's grains breads chart, which I will show you here on this next slide. So in your handout packet on page 8 and 9 of the electronic version, you have the grains breads chart. And this is the chart that you use to determine how a grain item contributes to the meal pattern. The chart is divided into 9 groups, A through I. You can see group A, group B listed down the left-hand side of the page there. And then the grain items are listed in the middle. And if you look over at the right-hand columns, you see the weight or the portion size in ounces or grams is given for how much an item in that group must weigh to credit as either a fourth, a half, 3/4, or 1 ounce equivalent grain servings. So in group A, we see that an item must weigh 0.8 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. And the items in group B must weigh 1 ounce to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains, and so on as you go down the list there. Let's compare the weights needed to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent grain serving in groups A, B, C, kind of going down the chart there. What do you notice is happening? As you go down the list, the food item needs to weigh more to count as 1 serving because ingredients other than flour are in these products. So let's look at the cookies in group C. In group C, an item must weigh, the plain cookies must weigh 1.2 ounces to provide 1 grain serving. Whereas if you look at a cookie with nuts, raisins, or chocolate chips, which falls into group E on your chart, those cookies must weigh 2.4 ounces to provide 1 grain serving. Next, I want to draw your attention to group H. So look for rice and pasta. A half a cup of cooked rice and pasta equals a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. So if this is your only grain for the day, remember that those grades 9 through 12 will need a full 1 cup portion of cooked rice or pasta to meet the 2 ounce equivalent grain requirement for that grain group. And then also look at group I for the cereal. It depends on the kind of cereal. So 1 cup of flake cereal or 1/4 a cup of granola or 1 1/4 cup of puff cereal equals a 1 ounce equivalent. Also your bowl packs, if you're serving bowl packs, usually tell you how those items credited as well. And I just wanted to mention here that you must always round down to the nearest 1/4 serving when using this chart. So for example, in group A, if your item weighs 0.7 ounces, you could only credit that for 3/4 ounce equivalent of grains. You can't round that up to the 1 ounce equivalent. And we'll go through some examples to show you how that works. Okay, next slide. So to calculate your grain servings, there's 2 basic methods. You can weigh your item and compare it to the grain breads chart like we just talked about, or you can weigh your product and then do a little bit of math. And we do recommend that you, if you don't have one already, that you do get at least a small digital food scale, and you can purchase these from lots of places. I think even Walmart or Amazon have those for pretty cheap. So if you're just using it for that, those would be some ideas of where to get a digital food scale. Next slide. So the math equation for calculating a grain serving is the weight of your grain item divided by the weight equivalent to 1 serving from the correct group on the grain breads chart we just talked about. And that equals the number of grain servings. And then remember, like we talked about, round down to the nearest 1/4 serving. So the weight of the grain item divided by the weight equivalent to 1 serving equals the number of grain servings. So let's go through an example. Next slide. A homemade cinnamon roll. We have a homemade cinnamon roll. It weighs 2.5 ounces. So let's find that on our grain breads chart. I see that unfrosted sweet roll is listed in group D on the grains bread chart. So using the equation we just discussed, we take 2.5 ounces divided by the weight equivalent to 1 serving, which in that group is 2 ounces. So 2.5 ounces divided by 2 ounces equals 1.25. You need to round down to the nearest 4th grain serving. So a 2.5 ounce cinnamon roll provides 1.25 or 1 1/4 ounce equivalents of grain. So just because it weighs 2.5 ounces doesn't mean that it credits for 2.5 grains. You need to do the math and figure out what equivalent grain servings it credits for. Next slide. Okay, we're gonna do a little activity and practice. This isn't gonna be on the computer, so you're not going to annotate or do any polling questions or anything, but either in your, off to the side on your slides or on your slide or on a piece of scratch paper, and using your grain breads chart, which is once again located on page 8 to 9 of that electronic version. We're gonna practice finding which group the grain item is in. and then calculate how many grains that credits for. So let's practice the first one together. The first one is the hoagie bun. So let's look at our grain breads chart. And in group B, I see hamburger and hot dog buns listed. So I think that would be the most appropriate group for the hoagie bun. So we'll go with group B. And our hoagie bun weighs 2 ounces. So we take 2 divided by the 1 ounce, which is the weight equivalent to 1 grain serving in group B on the chart. And that equals 2 ounce equivalents whole grain rich servings. So 2 divided by 1 equals 2 ounce equivalents. And Allie, you can go ahead and put the answer up there so they have an example. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 minutes here. So at 10:55, I'll give you to work on this. So find the group on the grain breads chart where each of those items are located. And then using that math equation, figure out how many whole grain rich servings those items would credit for. One more minute here.
Recording.
Okay, I have 10:55 on my clock, so let's go through the answers together and talk about them. The first one, the blueberry muffin, I find that in group D. So and our blueberry muffin weighs 1.5 ounces. In group D, a muffin must weigh 2 ounces to credit as 1 grain serving. So if you take our 1.5 ounce muffin divided by 2, that equals 0.75. So that is equal to 0.75 ounce equivalents of grain. Up next, we have our snickerdoodle cookie. Since it doesn't have any chocolate chips or anything like that added to it, I find that cookie in group C, and it weighs 1 ounce. And like we talked about in the example, for items in that group to credit for 1 ounce of grains, they need to weigh 1.2 ounces. So if you take 1 divided by 1.2, that equals 0.833. But remember, you can't round up, so you do have to round down. So it would credit for 0.75 ounce equivalents of grains. Up next, we have the cooked pasta in group H. And we have 1 cup of cooked pasta. And remember, a half a cup of cooked pasta credits for 1 ounce equivalent of a grain serving. So if you take 1 divided by a half, that gives us 2 ounce equivalents of grains. So 1 cup of pasta credits for 2 ounce equivalents of grains. And finally, we have our chocolate chip granola bar. I see that in group E. Our granola bar weighs 1 ounce, but for it to credit for 1 serving, it must weigh 2.4 ounces. So we take 1 divided by 2.4 ounces, and that actually equals 0.416, and that's pretty close to a half, but remember, we still can't round up, even though that's close to a half, we have to round down. So your 1 ounce chocolate chip granola bar is only going to provide 0.25 ounce equivalents of grains. So that's not very much. So just keep that in mind when you are planning your menus. Okay, I think it's almost time for another break. So let's break for 3 minutes and come back